Somewhere in the subtropical forests of Paraguay, there grows a small, unassuming shrub with jagged little leaves. Chew one, and something strange happens. A sweetness floods your mouth. Not like sugar, but somehow more intense, more lingering, almost 300 times stronger. It doesn't look special. It doesn't smell particularly sweet. And yet, for the people who first discovered it, this small green leaf was nothing short of remarkable. Indigenous communities knew about this plant for centuries, long before any outsider ever wrote its name down. Global food companies didn't catch on for almost 100 years after Europeans first documented it. And when one of the world's largest corporations finally did, it didn't just adopt the plant. It reshaped an entire industry around it. Today, you'll find it in soda cans, in tabletop sweetener packets, in yogurt, in gum, quietly present in thousands of products on grocery shelves around the world. But its story begins far from any factory or supermarket, in a quiet forest, with people who never needed a laboratory to understand what they'd found. This is the history of Stevia. Our story begins with the Guarani people, an indigenous group whose traditional territory spans parts of modern Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina. For generations long before written records, Guarani communities cultivated and used a small shrub they called kaheri, literally he sweet herb. They used the leaves in several distinct ways, chewed directly straight off the plant for a burst of intense sweetness, steeped into teas, releasing their flavor slowly into hot water, and, perhaps most commonly, used to sweeten yerba mate, the notoriously bitter, caffeine-rich drink that remains central to daily life across much of South America to this day. It wasn't treated as a rare delicacy reserved for special occasions or ceremonies. It was simply a familiar plant, woven into daily life, passed down through generations of practical oral knowledge, the kind of knowledge that doesn't get written into books, but gets taught instead, hand to hand, parent to child, exactly the way you'd learn to recognize any useful plant in your environment. This is worth pausing on because it's central to understanding Stevia's entire story. Because this knowledge lived within Guarani communities, passed through spoken tradition rather than written scientific record, it existed for centuries in a strange kind of limbo, thoroughly known, deeply, practically, intimately known by the people who actually used it every day, and yet completely invisible to the wider world, which, at the time, only considered something discovered once it had been documented, classified, and published according to European scientific conventions. That began to change in 1899, when Swiss-Italian botanist Moises Santiago Bertoni, working in Paraguay, formally documented the plant for Western science. The path to that documentation wasn't quick or straightforward. Bertoni had actually first heard about the plant secondhand from a chemist named Antonio Ovidio Rebaudiana, who described local reports of an intensely sweet herb used by indigenous communities. Bertoni became fascinated, and it took him years of searching through Paraguayan forests before he finally tracked down and properly classified the species himself. When he finally succeeded, he named the plant Stevia rebaudiana, honoring both the broader genus name and Rebaudiana, the chemist whose early reports had first pointed him toward it. Naming a plant, though, is only the first step. The far more interesting question for scientists and eventually for entire industries was exactly what made it so intensely sweet. Early chemical analysis in the following decades began identifying the compounds responsible, a family of molecules called steviol glycosides with names like stevioside and rebaudioside. These weren't simple sugars at all. They were entirely different types of molecules that happened to trigger an intensely sweet response on the tongue, naturally occurring compounds that could be, weight for weight, roughly 200 to 300 times sweeter than ordinary table sugar, yet contributing essentially 0 calories to whatever they sweetened. On paper, this looked like an extraordinary discovery, a natural calorie-free sweetener, hundreds of times more potent than sugar, already safely used by generations of Guarani communities. And yet, for the first half of the 20th century, that's almost exactly where it stayed. On paper, a botanical curiosity, known to a small circle of specialists, documented in scientific journals, but almost entirely ignored by the rest of the world, which had no obvious reason yet to take much interest in a South American shrub. Stevia's real global journey didn't begin in Europe, and it didn't begin in the Americas either. It began in Japan, and it began with a crisis. In the decades following the Second World War, Japan faced serious sugar shortages and a heavy, expensive reliance on imported sugar at a time when the country was still rebuilding much of its economy and infrastructure from the ground up. At the same time, Japan was growing increasingly cautious about synthetic artificial sweeteners like cyclamates, several of which were coming under growing health scrutiny internationally throughout the 1960s and 70s, eventually leading to bans in a number of countries. This left an obvious gap. A country that needed alternatives to expensive imported sugar, but was wary of trusting synthetic, lab-made substitutes. Japanese researchers began seriously investigating stevia as a natural alternative starting in the 1970s. This wasn't a casual interest. It involved years of dedicated work developing proper cultivation techniques suited to Japan's climate, alongside extraction methods sophisticated enough to purify the sweet compounds into something genuinely usable in commercial food production. By the late 1970s, this work had paid off. Japan formally approved stevia extract for food use, and it rapidly became one of the country's most widely used sweeteners, appearing in soft drinks, in traditional pickled foods, and across a remarkably wide range of packaged products found in ordinary Japanese grocery stores. For roughly the next 3 decades, Japan would remain the world's largest stevia market by a wide margin, while most of the Western world had barely even heard the plant's name. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, stevia hit a wall, and it would stay stuck behind that wall for the better part of 2 decades. In 1991, the United States Food and Drug Administration effectively restricted stevia's import and sale as a food additive, citing insufficient safety data to support its use as a general-purpose sweetener. This restriction arrived despite the fact that stevia had already been safely consumed for generations by Guarani communities in Paraguay, and had already been an approved, widely used sweetener in Japan for over a decade at that point. With no significant safety concerns emerging from its use there, the restriction created a strange and somewhat awkward loophole. Stevia could still technically be sold in the United States, but only if labeled specifically as a dietary supplement, not as a food additive or sweetener in its own right. Practically, this meant it couldn't legally be added directly into packaged food and beverages the way sugar, aspartame, or other approved sweeteners could be. Critics at the time pointed to something uncomfortable lurking behind the regulatory language. The American sugar industry and the artificial sweetener industry built around products like aspartame and saccharin. Both had enormous financial stakes in existing sweetener markets, and both had strong incentives to keep a cheap, natural zero-calorie competitor from breaking into the mainstream. Whether or not industry lobbying was the deciding factor behind the FDA's specific decision remains genuinely debated, but the practical outcome is not in dispute. American stevia stayed sidelined in health food store supplement aisles for nearly 2 decades, while the rest of the world, Japan especially, moved steadily ahead without it. The turning point finally came in the mid-2000s, and it arrived from an unlikely direction: the beverage industry itself, as consumer demand shifted hard toward natural ingredients and steadily away from artificial sweeteners like aspartame. Throughout the early 2000s, major beverage companies began seriously investing in refining stevia extraction technology. The specific target of that research was a compound called rebaudioside A, or Reb A for short, one of the several steviol glycosides found in the plant. but notably one that carried less of the mildly bitter, licorice-like aftertaste associated with cruder, less refined stevia extracts. Coca-Cola and the agricultural giant Cargill jointly developed a highly purified Reb A sweetener, which they brought to market under the brand name Truvia. Not far behind, PepsiCo developed its own competing version, marketed under the name Pura Via. Both companies pushed hard and pushed quickly for regulatory approval in the United States, recognizing the enormous commercial opportunity a natural zero-calorie sweetener represented. In December 2008, that approval finally came. The FDA granted generally recognized as safe status, commonly abbreviated GRAS, to purified Reb A stevia extract, finally clearing the way for it to be used directly in mainstream American food and beverages. It had taken nearly 2 decades from the original 1991 import restriction to reach this point. Within just a few years of that approval, stevia-sweetened products exploded across the American market. Sodas, yogurts, tabletop sweetener packets, and thousands of packaged foods rushed to add the words natural zero-calorie sweetener to their labels, a phrase that only a decade earlier would have been almost unthinkable for a plant most American consumers had never even heard of. Today, stevia is grown commercially across a far wider footprint than its native Paraguayan forests. Major cultivation now takes place in China, which produces the majority of the world's raw stevia leaf supply, alongside continued significant production in Paraguay itself, as well as Kenya, and select growing regions within the United States. Modern extraction technology has become remarkably sophisticated compared to those early Japanese purification methods of the 1970s. Today's processes can isolate specific individual steviol glycosides with real precision, fine-tuning sweetness profiles and minimizing bitter aftertaste even further. It's worth being balanced here, though, rather than purely celebratory. While stevia is generally recognized as safe by regulatory bodies and does offer a genuine zero-calorie alternative to sugar, some critics raise legitimate concerns about how heavily processed and industrially refined modern stevia extracts have become. Quite a distance removed from the simple whole-leaf plant that Guarani communities originally chewed and brewed for centuries. And, as with any sweetener, individual taste tolerance and any mild aftertaste sensitivity still vary considerably from person to person. What remains undeniable, though, is the sheer scale of stevia's transformation from a quietly cultivated forest shrub, known intimately by Guarani communities for centuries, largely unrecognized by the rest of the world for another 100 years after that, through a Japanese sugar crisis, an American regulatory standoff, and finally a corporate breakthrough to one of the most widely used sweeteners on the entire planet today. Stevia's story is really about how long it can take the world to catch up to knowledge that already existed, quietly, for generations, within the communities who found it first. 100 years between indigenous use and Western documentation, another 80 years before real commercial adoption, and 2 more decades before America finally approved it. Sometimes discovery isn't about the moment something is found. It's about how long it takes everyone else to notice. If you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe. Every week, Herb and Lore uncovers the hidden history behind the herbs sitting quietly in your kitchen cabinet. Next week, a root once worth more than gold. The strange history of ginseng.